Hi, my name is Ed, and today I'm going to talk about growth, or once you have nailed it, ideas on how to scale it. But before I get into that, I thought I'd share the last 2 decades of my life summarized in one slide. So starting with the top left corner here, this was back when I was in college, and I built my first website with my roommates. It was called datesite.com. And the way it worked, it was a simple crush site. You'd put in email addresses of people you had a crush on, they'd get an email saying somebody likes you, and then they'd have to put in email addresses of people they had crushes on. And if you had a crush on one another, we'd match you up and say, you two matched, you should go on a date. So when we launched this on Valentine's Day of 1999, within 1 week, a quarter of the students at Harvard had signed up for it. And I was blown away by the viral growth. And I was studying physics at the time and really interested in the mathematics behind that virality. So that was my first experiment, building something on the consumer internet that grew exponentially. And then if we move to the clockwise, to the top right, this is a picture of my team at Friendly, which was a startup that I founded after I went out to Stanford for business school. Friendly was a social question and answer site. And we grew Friendly to about 25 million registered users before selling to Facebook. And using a lot of those same viral growth techniques is how we grew Friendly to that size. When we sold to Facebook, I ended up joining Facebook and running the international growth team. So I was in charge of helping Facebook grow its user base in other parts of the world, including a lot of the emerging markets, such as India, Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa, as well as some of our most competitive markets at the time, which were Japan, Russia, and Korea. And then on the bottom left, this was my growth team at Uber, which was a small startup I joined after I left Facebook to start up their growth team. And at Uber, I started up the growth team and then later ran the product team before leaving and moving back to the East Coast, where I now have lived for the past few years, investing in startups. So I am going to talk about growth in 5 slides. And these are the topics of each of these slides. So the first thing is you need to find your product market fit first before growing. Secondly, I'm going to go into how to optimize your viral loop, then talk about the importance of removing barriers, the importance of internationalizing your product, and finally, at scale, growth becomes a lot more about retention than acquisition. So first, just a quick note on the importance of finding product market fit first. I've personally made the mistake of growing things before we've had product market fit. And in hindsight, you really want to get that fit first. So product market fit, the way I think about it is that's when people love your product, when engagement is high, retention is high, and even if you only have a small number of people using your product, at least they really are super engaged and keep using it. That's a good time to start growing. And the reason I have this picture here is I like to think of finding product market fit as kind of like drilling for oil. You never know exactly where that oil is going to be, and no matter how good of a founder you are, and no matter how good your drill is, if you drill in the wrong place, you're not going to find that product market fit. So there's a lot of luck involved, but once you do find it, that's the right time to start growing. So this is a simple picture of the viral loop. I like to think about it as starting at the top where it says C. And what I mean by that is if you've never heard of a product before, you usually find out about it maybe from a friend, maybe from an email you've received or a text message you've received. And if that catches your interest, then you'll actually go sign up for that product. You'll then use the product, and if you like it, you might share it so that other people see it. And so, just as an example, you can take Uber here. We had something called Give a Ride, Get a Ride. And the way it would work is you'd just basically be able to share free rides with friends who hadn't yet signed up for Uber. So they'd get a message, maybe an email saying, Ed's shared a free ride on Uber with you, they would then sign up and use it, use their free ride, and then they could share free rides with their friends. And what you can do is basically measure the conversion rate on each of these steps where you see the arrows, and do A/B tests, and basically keep optimizing until you get the numbers higher. And you can also multiply out all of the numbers around this loop to calculate your K factor, which is a way of figuring out how close you are to getting exponential viral growth if your K factor is above 1. And just as an example, when at Uber, when we did Give a Ride, we did a lot of A/B testing. One example was we used to say give $20, get $20. And we found that saying give a ride, get a ride actually had better conversion from the C step to the sign up step, even though the average ride was less than $20. So a lot of times, very simple tweaks like that can make a difference. As an example, at Facebook, we found that when you sign up for Facebook, you go through the sign up flow, and part of that asks you, would you like to import all of your contacts so that you can find your friends? And when people would skip that step, we found that if we just popped something up that said, are you sure you want to skip this step? Facebook's much better with friends. That actually made a pretty big difference in terms of getting people to actually connect with their friends and send invites to new users. So those are just a couple of examples of the types of things you can do to A/B test the viral loop. The next thing I want to talk about is the importance of removing barriers. And one of the biggest barriers for any paid product is the price. So that's why on here I'm showing the evolution of Uber, how Uber started out as really just a premium product to taxi with Uber Black. It was more expensive than taxi. It was something that you maybe would use on a date night, but not every day. And part of the reason over time we introduced lower cost products at Uber, first UberX, and then price cuts on UberX, and finally Uber Pool, is that every time we introduced a product that was less expensive, demand would go up. So, reducing price is one great way to remove barriers, but there are other examples of barriers as well. For example, if you are building an iPhone app and you don't have an Android version of the app, that's a barrier to anyone who has an Android phone. Or, Facebook in the early days only allowed people with .edu email addresses to sign up. That was a barrier for anyone who didn't have a .edu email address. A lot of times these barriers are somewhat obvious, and there may be reasons early on that you don't do all of that, but over time, you can unlock growth by removing barriers. Next, I want to talk about internationalizing your product. And when I say internationalize, I don't just mean make sure you translate everything into different languages. That is important, but that's just one part of internationalizing things. A lot of times there are also cultural differences in different parts of the world. And I'll just give two examples of this, one from my time at Facebook and one from my time at Uber. So at Facebook, we found that in Japan in particular, a lot of people were not inviting their friends when they would sign up for Facebook. And when we dug into it, with our team in Japan, we realized that a lot of people felt like it was rude to send invites. And so what we did was we made a simple tweak, and instead of calling them invites, we called them announcements. And we would ask new users, would you like to have Facebook announce to all of your friends that you're now on Facebook and this is where they can find you? And Japan went from one of our slowest growing countries to one of our fastest growing countries just by making that copy tweak. Another example at Uber was in India. We found that a lot of people in India did not have credit cards, or even if they did have credit cards, they weren't comfortable paying for their Uber rides with credit cards. And so this was a bit controversial at the time we tested it, but we decided, what if we let people use Uber and pay in cash? And so we tested this out first in Hyderabad, India, and found that 2 times as many people successfully completed their first paid trip when they were allowed to pay for it in cash. And a lot of those people would ultimately later on add their credit cards. But it was another example of removing a barrier, the barrier of entering your credit card number the first time you use an app. Finally, I just want to quickly talk about the importance of focusing on retention at scale. So when you're very small and you're growing, a lot of focus is on acquisition, on acquiring new users. But over time, as you get bigger and bigger, for example, the scale Facebook got to and Uber got to, what you see is it gets harder and harder to acquire new users, especially if you already have billions of users on the platform. And then churn also goes up. If you assume that's a roughly constant percentage of your active user base, as your active user base increases, your churn increases as well as an absolute number. And the importance of re-engagement is also more important as you get bigger. So this is just a reminder that as you scale, you need to start shifting more focus to retaining your existing users, re-engaging your churned users, and not quite as much focus on acquisition. And this equation down here, this is a simple growth accounting equation, but it's one way to think about growth over time. And just a couple of examples here. So, at Facebook, as we realized churn and re-engagement were actually bigger levers of growth than acquisition, we started to shift the growth team's focus more to things like friending, because we found that friending was one of the best ways to keep people engaged on Facebook. If you had more friends, you were less likely to churn. And so things like PYMK, people you may know, was an important way to make sure people were able to connect with their friends on Facebook. And at Uber, an example of this was the driver loyalty program. Increasing retention of drivers was really important. And so we looked into, we thought about what are different ways to keep drivers on the platform and keep them from churning. So that was a summary of how to grow in 5 slides. On the right here, I've just also listed a few of the companies I've invested in and been advising over the past few years. That's pretty much what I spend my time doing these days. But with these next 15 minutes, I thought I would just open it up to Q&A. So let's see. I'm just looking at the first question here. When will you consider user engagement in a social network? We are building a community around platform-based business models. So when will you consider user engagement in a social network? I mean, I think this comes back to the point I was making at the very beginning, which is I actually think it's important to focus on engagement before focusing on growth. And as I mentioned at Friendly, for example, we focused on growth first, and we were able to grow Friendly to that number I shared before, 25 million registered users, but they weren't super engaged. And so they weren't coming back with enough frequency. And it was a lot harder to iterate on a product that already had 25 million users than it would have been if we only had a few hundred users or a few thousand users. So I'd say, even with a social network, of course, there are network effects, and you need to have at least some critical mass before it starts to become useful. But, think about Facebook in the early days. It launched at Harvard only. And even when it just had a few hundred or a few thousand users that were at Harvard, I think they found that to be a very useful product. I remember I actually signed up in the first week and my user ID is 2404. So you don't need huge numbers to start to focus on engagement. And the best time to experiment with engagement and the things that drive that, I think, is when you're small. Let me look at the next question here. Would be great to learn more about how you look at K-factor and work with it. For example, what is a good value K-factor at the early stage? Great question. So let me just quickly go back to this slide with the viral loop. And so I know I kind of went over it quickly, but the way you calculate your K factor is you basically multiply the conversion rates of each of these steps where you see blue arrows together, uh, and then you multiply that by the average number of friends it's shared with per person who shares to get your K factor. You can, that may not have not been a very clear explanation. You can look online if you're look it up online if that didn't make sense. But once you calculate your K factor, anything above 1.0 is something that will grow exponentially. Anything below one, you don't see any exponential growth. So some people would say, well, so then it doesn't matter if it's below one. If you're not going to grow, it has to be above one. But there are actually some benefits to having it even a 0.5, for example, because what that means is you haven't hit that tipping point where it goes exponential. But if every user on average is getting 0.5 friends to sign up, you're effectively getting 2 users for the price of one. So especially if you have a business where you are paying to acquire users and you have your CAC, your customer acquisition cost, if you can get a K factor of 0.5, you're basically cutting your CAC in half. And that can be the difference between unit economics that work and don't work, for example. In terms of what's a good K factor, at the beginning, I'd say, there are things I've built that on day one had a K factor of 0.1, and I've gotten them above one over time. So that's like a 10x improvement. Now that's not easy to get from a 0.1 to above one, but you could think about it as if you find a 2x improvement 3 times, you're almost there. And so sometimes I recommend looking for those big swings, looking for the things that can have the 2x improvement and not just an incremental 5% improvement, especially early on. Let me see the next question here. Okay. When would you start to focus on retention, and how would you define scale? Good question. So I don't think there's, any number at which you suddenly shift focus from acquisition to retention. And as I mentioned before, engagement and retention are tend to be highly correlated. So you kind of want to be thinking about that from day one, and you don't want to start growing something until you at least have some good retention numbers. But in terms of when do you shift that focus, I'd say go back to that growth accounting framework right here. And if you look at, are you acquiring more users? Or if you look at over the past week, for example, did your growth grow? Did your active user base grow more due to newly acquired users, or the combination of churned and re-engaged users? As soon as the churn number and re-engagement number start to become as big or bigger than the acquisition number, that's when I think it's a good time to really start to focus more on retention than on acquisition. Someone says, what needs to be done so you could become one of our advisors? I work with a very small number of companies right now, but please feel free to message me and we can talk about that offline. Next question. What metrics would you consider great PMF or product market fit indicators for a two-sided marketplace? So good question. I think the first metric I look at in terms of product market fit is retention. So I would look at, if someone starts using your product, how likely are they going to be using it a month from now or even a week from now? So I think retention is probably the best indicator of product market fit. And engagement, I think of as more of how much time are they spending that first time they use it. That's also a good indication of product market fit. And I think that applies to a two-sided marketplace just as much as it does to any other type of product. I guess the one other thing with a two-sided marketplace is you want to look at both sides. So for example, part of what attracted me to join Uber back when I did was not only did all of my friends who used Uber as a customer love it, but all the drivers I spoke with in the early days talked about how much they loved it as well. It was a flexible way to make a living, and they valued the flexibility. Their earnings were higher than they had been before. So both sides of the marketplace really valued it, and I think that's a really good sign. Let's see. Next question. What were your top 3 viral mechanics? I'm not sure how to answer this in terms of top 3, but here's what I'll say is when you draw out your viral loop and then you start to measure each step of that viral loop, the first thing I look for is where are the biggest drop-offs happening? So, back to your viral loop. If you see that, tons of invites are getting sent out, there are a lot of people who are seeing the invites, but very few of them are actually signing up, then I would spend a lot of time just iterating on the copy of the invite. In fact, that's one of the simplest A/B tests to do, and that's where I tend to see that new potential customer is seen. Then I would also look at the use to share arrow. So a lot of times people maybe won't think to share. And so are there ways you can incentivize your current users to share with their friends? Just taking a quick example from DateSite, that first website I built in college, we noticed at first a lot of people were not entering that many email addresses of people they had crushes on. And then when we said, well, we'll give you a hint for every 2 email addresses you enter, suddenly they started entering way more email addresses than they were before. So just giving that incentive of a hint increased that use to share arrow. Let me look at the next question, and I think we got about 5 more minutes. So, okay, do you think that a paid membership for users to access any community, for example, groups on Facebook, would have slowed down the growth at Facebook? Yeah, so I think anytime you ask for someone to pay for something, you'll get fewer people to convert than if it's free. That goes back to the barriers. That said, if as long as there are parts of the product that are completely free, I think the freemium approach can work well, where if the core viral loop is all free, but then you encourage some percentage of the people that are using the free version of the product to pay for an upgraded experience, I think that can work, and that can be the best of both worlds. So what you want to try not to do is introduce a payment step in the actual viral loop, because if you're trying, especially if you're trying to get that K factor above 1, if there's a step that requires any form of payment, you're going to quickly have a big drop off that will make it almost impossible to get that K factor above 1. In fact, I'm not sure if I know of any. There probably are examples, but I would have a difficult time finding a product that required an actual payment before you could try it that truly had a K factor above 1. Let's see. Next question. What are the best examples of leading indicators of good customer retention from your professional experience? Good leading indicators of customer retention. So I think a lot of times I just go with, is this a product that people who are using it love it, that they feel like it's magical? I feel like it's one of those things that you almost just know it when you see it. So if you get the sense that your users feel that way from the first time they experience it, that's a really good sign as in terms of a leading indicator of, of longer term retention. And I know that's a very qualitative and not very quantitative, but um, I think that would be the first thing I would just look for. And there are ways you can quantify that kind of thing as well, and whether it's an NPS and surveying users to ask how much they like the product, or are they likely to refer it to a friend. But I think some measure of customer satisfaction can be a leading indicator of retention. And let's see, there's one more question on here. What are your thoughts on three-sided marketplace platforms? Are there any in your experience that nailed network effects, growth, and success? I don't think I've directly worked on any three-sided marketplace platforms, so I don't think I have anything that comes to mind there. But if you have a specific one you want me to analyze, let me know. I'd be interested to see kind of what's out there. Let's see, are there any other questions? It looks like that might be the last question, and I think we are also about out of time. So, oh, sorry, one more question just came in. How do these techniques apply to B2B marketplaces and platforms? Does it simply translate one-to-one? Great question. I've been asked this question several times. Can you make B2B businesses grow in these viral ways? I'd say a lot of this stuff does translate and applies whether it's B2B or B2C. I think it's more difficult to get something that's B2B to become truly viral, in that the K factor gets above 1. Because if you just think about that viral loop, it's there's probably going to be a lot more friction in the viral loop and just places where you get that drop off. But again, you don't have to get your K factor above 1 to grow, especially if you do have CAC and LTV and unit economics that work. Just even getting a bit of virality can make a big difference. In terms of the other things we talked about, though, whether it's removing barriers or internationalization, retention, I think all of that stuff applies to B2B just as much as it does B2C. Let's see if there's anything else here. And I actually think we may be out of time. Let's see, I'll just go ahead and keep answering questions until they cut me off, because I think we're out of time. But this question says, as a startup in the tourism industry, how would you handle retention to counter seasonality problems? Yeah, pretty much every business I've worked with has had seasonality of some form. And I think sometimes there are ways to counter it. For example, in tourism, maybe by, for example, one thing we found at Facebook was we had more seasonality when we were US only than we did when Facebook became a true global presence. A lot of times things just in certain parts of the world canceled out things in other parts of the world. So in the early days, you'd see much more, ups and downs. And then as Facebook became more global, you saw less seasonality. So I'd say one way to counter it is to become more international. But it's also okay to have seasonality. And I remember at Uber, the first couple of years when we'd have dips during the slower times of year, we weren't sure if it was seasonality or if we were just suddenly, we stopped growing for some reason. And so we would do everything we could to try to, how do we grow faster? But after a couple of years of seeing those patterns, we started to become more aware of that and more comfortable with that happening. All right, I think that was the last question. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.